Hey everyone, welcome to this AZ-2007, Accelerating Application Development by using GitHub Copilot. My name is Peter Detender. I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here at Microsoft, presenting from Redmond. I've been in the trainer role for a bit more than 5 years. Initially about 2 years from Belgium and moved 3 years ago to the Redmond area, where I'm still in the same role. Throughout my trainer career over the last 15 years, I started with Azure architecting, gradually moved into application modernization, teaching Azure DevOps, teaching AZ-2004, and then gradually moving into AI and Copilot. If you should have any questions when watching this module, I would encourage you to stay in touch, so don't hesitate reaching out by email or connecting on LinkedIn. Now, this course has 5 different modules. So depending a bit where you stepped in, allow me to walk you through the different modules. So obviously, as always, you can imagine, we have a starting module. From there, we're going to talk about a lot of really cool features. And I say in talking, but it's actually going to be quite demo heavy as well, touching on generating documentation. Maybe one of the things that you as a developer or DevOps engineer are not always liking, right? Then obviously the biggest part is going to be the actual developing coding features, which means that now GitHub Copilot is going to become your pair programming friend. And then in the other 2 modules, we're going to cover developing unit testing, one of the more challenging tasks for developers, I would say, and then closing with talking about implementing code optimization and code improvements. So with that, let's get started with the first module, getting started with GitHub Copilot. This module is going to cover a lot of different things. And again, it's the starting one, so I can imagine that for some of you, this might actually be quite familiar. It means that you already know how to use GitHub Copilot. If you're joining and you've never used it before, I'm going to start with an introduction of how generative AI is now really revolutionizing our IT world. And then moving into how to deploy it, how to use it from within your trusted development environment, how to install the extensions, and then validating, testing them, and also talking about a few configuration options. Now, when we think about the different tools that you as a developer need, I'm going to switch to my whiteboard for a second and actually getting some input from all of you. Now, before going through the actual presentation content, let's get you moving and thinking a bit about the following question. What about Microsoft tools and services would you as a developer need or use to be able to build compelling AI-enriched applications? So you could help me here a little bit getting you into that whiteboarding mode, I would say. So even on your end, you could take a little piece of paper and a pen, writing down some of those keywords, or obviously taking like a little notepad on your laptop. Now, if you would think about it, some of the core tools, I think first of all is obviously Azure AI services. That's where you're going to find all the different capabilities within our Azure AI platform, allowing you to deploy models, which I think would be the next step. Because in the meantime, you have so many different large language models to choose from, and they might impact your application experience a little bit. Once you start looking into developing the actual app, I would say you have 2 options. You could use Copilot Studio. That would be the low-code, no-code approach, or moving to Azure AI Foundry, which is the new name of Azure AI Studio from before. And then the actual developing task is happening from Visual Studio Code or using Visual Studio, and I'll walk you through a lot of this in my demos later on. And then ultimately, that's obviously the core of this class, you're going to start using GitHub Copilot. So to me, these would be like the core tools that you're going to use as a developer to integrate your AI experience into your new built applications. So with that, let's switch back to our presentation and get started. So thanks for helping in the whiteboarding exercise. Now, to make sure that you have a good understanding about all the different, I would say, reference tools that we would recommend for any developer starting to build or continue building AI-inspired applications, let me walk you through some of our core ecosystem. So first, obviously, it starts with Azure AI Services. That's the component in our Azure platform, allowing you to interact with the large language models. On top of that, we now have Azure AI Foundry, which recently got renamed, actually coming from Azure AI Studio. Now, the Studio is the AI-specific services portal that you're going to use to define your language models, validating them, testing them, maybe testing out your chat conversations, defining the system message, and more like that. Then obviously Copilot Studio is also an option for developers. Now, it's described as a low-code or no-code Copilot scenario, allowing you to develop your custom Copilots without writing that much code. Semantic kernel is another option that allows you to really augment the intelligence of your applications. So by using our open source Semantic kernel SDK, it not only allows you to build your chat conversations using the large language model trained information, but adding your real-time information on top of that. And then from a development tooling perspective, obviously you have Visual Studio Code. Now, one of the tools I'm mentioning here is Visual Studio IntelliCode, which I would say is not really considered generative AI anymore. It's what allows you to complete your code syntax. But that's where later on we're going to talk about how amazing GitHub Copilot is now helping you with that. And then ChatGPT is, I would say, the starting point of a lot of the generative AI scenarios, allowing you to really bring in that natural language, recognizing the large language models, and starting to have that conversational context. And then obviously I need to close with GitHub Copilot, which is now becoming our peer programming friend, our peer programming colleague, allowing you to do a lot of amazing things. And that's what I'm going to walk you through in this module already. Now, talking about GitHub Copilot, a lot of things starts with what are the different flavors, the different options, and yes, it also means the different licensing options that you could go through. So I'm going to start with one of the most obvious ones for you as an individual developer. It's GitHub Copilot Pro. What it's going to give you is an extensive list of features. And no, I'm not going to read them from the screen here, but it's giving you a lot of tools. It's obviously also why we do have 5 modules covering a lot of those features. You have Copilot integration in your code syntax, which means that you don't need to jump to, for example, our Microsoft Copilot or any other generative AI tool, switching back and forth no longer needed. It's really embedded into your coding syntax. Next to that, you have the chat pane, and I'll show you that in a couple of demos later on. And we're basically going to use this over and over in the other modules as well, where now you're going to have that traditional conversational context with your programming peer friend. Next to that, for larger enterprises, larger development teams, you could move up to GitHub Copilot Business. It's going to give you everything that I already mentioned from the Pro flavor, but adding a few extra features on top of that. And then ultimately, as a larger organization, you could move up into GitHub Copilot Enterprise Edition. It's going to give you everything from Pro, everything from Business, and yes, even still a little bit more. Now, next to that, we also have the free edition now. So the main message here is, first of all, you do have a lot of different flavors. So map it with the requirements as an individual developer, DevOps engineer, a larger development team, and obviously an enterprise team. Look at all the features in detail, maybe switch back to the GitHub documentation to make sure that you're really paying for what your organization is looking for. Now, next to that, it's also about why should we do it? Now, first of all, about 18 months ago, the world literally got revolutionized thanks to generative AI, which now means that we're bringing in that generative AI concept, natural language, large language models, having that chat completion, for example, into a lot of the tools. I personally like the branding Copilot. Why? Because it also means that you're still in control. You're a junior developer, media experience, maybe you're a senior developer, or maybe not always writing code that much, but you're still responsible for documentation. You're still responsible for maybe watching over your developers team. And that's also what GitHub Copilot can now help you with. So for example, here, some of those numbers, right? 55% is completing tasks faster. Now, why is that possible? Because it's going to allow you to document code. Because imagine you're a new developer, you're joining a new team, you're working on a new application, and you're not at all familiar with your team, you're not familiar with the code set, you're not familiar with the way the team is operating and all the other complexity that you need to be comfortable with just because you joined that team. Where now, thanks to GitHub Copilot, it's going to allow you to document code. It's going to allow you to explain code if you're new and you need to become familiar with that code syntax. It's even going to allow you to transform code from one language to the other. And again, we're going to walk you through all those features, a lot of them initially on slides and then quickly jumping to a whole set of demos. And that's just one of the so many factors. Why that 55% of the interviewers here mentioned like we can manage to complete code faster. 60% of that feeling more fulfilled. What it means is being happy in the role you're in. And to me, it always sounds a bit weird. Like, honestly, I'm not a developer. Yes, I do provide training on Azure developing solutions. I understand .NET code, and yes, I can create some sample apps, right? But I wouldn't call myself a developer. It's in the end why I'm a technical trainer, because I like doing training. Now, finding that happiness in the job is important. So how does GitHub Copilot help you becoming more happy in your job? It's just because it's a lot easier to write new code. It's easier to understand code. It's easier to create unit tests. It's easier to optimize performance and so many other responsibilities that you have as a developer. And then last is close to 87%, which is a big number here, referring to toil less. Now, toil, if you're not familiar with the term, it actually comes from Google like 15, 20 years ago already, where the DevOps teams within Google actually describes toil as the work that needs to be done, the work that you as a developer needs to focus on every now and then, but it's no fun to go through that. Like the weekly stand-up meetings, maybe fixing bugs, fixing issues, but you don't always see like what's the real purpose for that. And all that is just coming in thanks to GitHub Copilot. On the other side, already talked about benefits, but obviously keep in mind that in the end, it's just one of the so many other tools. Remember, a few minutes ago, we talked about your developer toolbox to write code, to understand code, and to integrate your AI services into your applications. Now, is it a magic tool? I would say, from Peter's perspective, yes, it's actually mind-blowing. Is it the ultimate magic tool? I have to be honest, not really. So what are some of the limitations? First of all, it's using large language models, which now means that there are always some limitations. Does it know the latest and greatest code set? Not really, because a large language model is bringing in information based on what it's been trained on, like the public code, which could be open source GitHub repositories, which could be other public internet resources, which means that your code should be seen as a suggestion, but it might not always fit for the full 100%. Next to that also, bringing in potential security risks, not always understanding the specific features, the specifics of what you as an organization already defined. Although we do have some scenarios, if you have the GitHub Enterprise Edition, it actually allows you to really tune and add some specific tweaks into how GitHub Copilot is actually behaving. Now, we talked about GitHub Copilot. Now, to be correct, there's actually two, I would say, features or main flavors. So first, you have the GitHub Copilot extension. And that's really the plugin you're going to integrate into your Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio environment. And that's bringing in a lot of those generative AI inspired features. Now, next to that, you also have GitHub Copilot Chat extension. So it's just a minor detail, right? But it actually allows you to really see it as two different scenarios, two different tools you want to start interacting with your code using generative AI. I already mentioned quite some impressive numbers, like how do customers actually experience GitHub Copilot in the first few months about using it. And then here out of the industry, there's a lot more interesting numbers. 50,000 businesses already adopted GitHub Copilot. Now, this slide is not 100% up to date, so you could imagine that it's actually already more than that. 1 out of the 3 Fortune 500 companies are already using GitHub Copilot. And then more than 55% of developers actually prefer to start using or continue using GitHub Copilot already. So again, what it means is It's just a go-to scenario if you're a developer, DevOps engineer, to start looking at GitHub Copilot. And remember that free edition could actually be pretty appealing to you already, and then gradually moving up to some of the other flavors. Now, what makes it so cool? And again, this is just the getting started, so it's like a little warm-up into the cooler features of the platform. But one of the first ones I would like to highlight is that auto-completion. And yes, I remember, and you know I was not a developer up to like 3 years ago, but I'm familiar with IntelliSense. What it allows you to do is you start writing some part of the code, and it tries to complete the rest of that sentence, the rest of maybe creating a class or something, and that was already helpful. Where now the autocomplete feature is really becoming smart. So for pretty much any development language, it's going to allow you to start typing and it's going to learn from your behavior. Next to that, if you open up multiple like files, part of your application source code, it's actually going to try and learn from that and recognizing a lot of the syntax, a lot of the keywords, which by the way is another pretty cool benefit. Because what you typically would do as a developer, if you're looking for some code snippets, like some boilerplate code, right, you would probably go to the internet, you would start searching for information using some snippet sample code from a vendor GitHub platform, maybe from within the application documentation, but then it's like a multiple step to actually get to something that's useful for what you need. The boilerplate code could be beneficial to help you like seeing the capability. But then it's not using your class's definition. It's not using your specific syntax. It's not recognizing anything from your specific organizational requirements. And that's where now the auto-completion feature is going to help you with that a lot. Another one here is that Copilot Chat AI Assistance. So again, it's the traditional chat completion experience. You're going to have that going back and forth communication style with your GitHub Copilot. So it's going to allow you to bring in the natural language. It's going to allow you to really use all the intelligence from the large language models. By the way, I didn't mention that yet, but you could actually choose which language model you're going to go for. Depending on the language, the development language, it's going to allow you to maybe switch between multiple of them. And that's also where I mentioned the details of the different licensing flavors, because not all flavors allow you to switch across all different large language models. But then think about input processing, for example, allowing you to really start writing part of your code, and it's just going to complete that for you. Then also implementing like some best practices. It's one of the last bullet points here. So how does it work? You start with writing your code. Again, could be a totally new application, could be an existing one where you're fixing one of the bugs, you're bringing in one of the new features, and you're going to start adopting your chat GitHub Copilot feature as your new friend. You're going to copy paste some code, or why not even embedding that chat conversation directly within your code snippet. So you don't even again have to switch windows anymore. You can integrate different languages, already mentioned that. And then you're going to have that conversation, and it's up to you, and that's again where you're still in control. It's not going to replace you as a developer, but it's going to make you a lot better developer. And then allowing you to accept the code suggestions, and they get immediately injected into your scenarios. And if you don't like it, just like any other development scenario, you just revert back. You can commit changes, and I'll show you a lot of that as well. Now from here again, just a little screenshot. I'm eager to jump into a demo a little bit later on, but it's so important to understand what that chat conversation is really bringing in as a power. So Smart Actions is one of them. So what is a Smart Action? It allows you to directly use your command line interface to start again interacting with your code. The chat view obviously is that pane that I'll show you a little bit later on in the demo, where you could open it up, you could close it, you could move it to the side if you have multiple monitors. So a lot of really cool behaviors there. And then the quick chat is, as the name suggests, it's like asking a little question. Can you verify this? Can you explain this? Can you document this? And so many other cool features, all available from that chat integration. So I think with that, we're almost done with getting you into that. What is so amazing about GitHub Copilot? So I think it's now more than time to switch to showing you in a demo how to get started. So I'm going to walk you through a few different topics here. First of all, how to install the extensions, how to validate them, how to get authenticated. And once the extension is running, by the way, I show you Visual Studio Code here, but I know that not all developers are using just Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to extend the demo a little bit and showing you the exact same behavior, but from the full-blown Visual Studio itself. So in this first demo, I'm going to show you how easy it actually is to install GitHub Copilot and GitHub Copilot Chat inside Visual Studio Code, which later on will be the main and development environment for all other demos. But since it's the starting point, I also going to stretch it a bit and showing you the exact same experience, but from Visual Studio itself. So I'm inside my Visual Studio Code environment here. And as you can imagine, if you have already been using Visual Studio Code, the magic behind the capabilities are the extensions. So I move into the extension window here on the side, and I'm going to search for GitHub Copilot. Now it's going to give you a set of extensions that obviously you have to choose from. In our case here, we're talking about these two extensions. Obviously for my demo, they are already installed, but it's nothing harder than selecting the specific extension. Initially selecting install, it's going to take like a minute, maybe not even. And from there, you can actually start using it. Now, quite important, you need to install GitHub Copilot. That's basically the code completion. And from there, also installing GitHub Copilot Chat, which going to give you that chat experience to interact with the generative AI in the backend. Apart from that, it's not really necessary for the demos, but I actually like to install this Copilot theme as well. What we're doing here is actually embracing the GitHub Copilot theme that they're using on the GitHub Copilot website and using that as your interface theme inside Visual Studio Code. Once the extensions have been installed, there's a few different ways to start navigating and actually using your GitHub Copilot integration. So it shows up here on the top right corner, and you can start using OpenChat or using the keyboard shortcuts, Control-Alt-I, just using Copilot edits, which would be Control-Shift-I, and you'll see me shifting across those experiences later on. But you could also navigate to some additional settings. If you move into settings, it's going to bring you into your actual GitHub environment in the browser, where depending on how your GitHub Copilot plan has been configured, which means could be Pro, could be the personal one, maybe even the free one that I talked about, and obviously also the enterprise one, where in my case, using my Microsoft Trainer account, I'm part of GitHub Copilot Enterprise, and I can see a lot of the different capabilities and features where I can use GitHub Copilot inside mobile, inside CLI, inside Visual Studio VS Code. And you can see that most of these settings are enabled, allowed, or maybe in your case, they could be disallowed. Now, since I'm using an enterprise flavor here, it means that myself cannot really change any of these settings. It's literally defined for my GitHub Enterprise environment. If we switch back to our Visual Studio Code environment, we actually have a few other settings we can play with. Now, these settings are valid for, I would say, the Visual Studio Code environment itself. So going into VS Code settings, it's going to open up our traditional settings for the tooling. And if again we search for GitHub, it's going to open up a little section with all possible settings that we can integrate with here. And if we navigate to GitHub Copilot, it's going to allow us, for example, to specify the behavior for specified languages. So that's actually pretty cool, because let's say you're, like in Peter's case, a .NET developer primarily, but not using Go language, not using Java or any other, you could actually tune and tweak the behavior a little bit. And again, remember, since you have two extensions, you also have different settings for each extension. So if I navigate to the GitHub Copilot Chat, it's again going to allow me to integrate project templates. It allows me to run like here in this case, fixing test failures. Do you want to use it? Yes or no? So that's actually pretty nice that you do have some modification capabilities to really tune it in the way you want to start using it. Once it's been installed, you can open up the actual chat window here and start running prompts, having chat completion, conversations with our little Copilot friend now. And to really start using it, obviously you also need to authenticate. So the first time you're going to start using it, it's actually going to provide you a little pop-up message, right, asking you for your GitHub credentials. So that's pretty much all it takes to actually start using, but first installing the extension, going over some configuration settings. I promised you about the same on the Visual Studio side, and as you can see, a lot of the experience is identical. So this is my live editor in my full Visual Studio. Again, here on top, right-hand corner, I do have my GitHub Copilot, and I can open up my chat. So how do you actually get it installed? Now, obviously, there's a few different ways in Visual Studio to install components. One option here is going to the Visual Studio Marketplace, marketplace.visualstudio.com. You search for GitHub Copilot, and from there, I would say make sure you select the first two options showing up here. And similar to VS Code, it's two extensions that you need to install. One for the interaction with generative AI, the code completion, and then the other extension to have that little chat window on the side. Another option is using Visual Studio Installer, where depending a bit, again, on the framework, the platform language you're using, it might be slightly different. What I did in my case is installing the .NET packages because I'm mainly writing .NET code, right? And then within individual components, you can again search for GitHub, and it's going to allow you to install the GitHub Copilot as part of the AI assistance section in the custom installer. So those are, I would say, the two most common scenarios, I guess, to install your extensions inside Visual Studio. And from there, the look and feel, the experience, the behavior of using the chat is identical between the two platforms. And I might actually shift between some of these during later demos in other modules. So with that, we're already at the end of this first module, where it was all about getting started with GitHub Copilot. So in short, we started with positioning GitHub Copilot, leveraging on the benefits from generative AI, integrating large language models, initially OpenAI, but in meantime allowing you to switch across different large language models. Next to that, we talked about how to integrate the Copilot features into your Visual Studio VS Code using the extensions, similar to integrating any other plugin into your development environment. And then out of the demo, showing you not only how to install the extensions, but how to validate that your GitHub Copilot is actually working, touching a little bit on the different licensing flavors. But apart from that, you could actually continue your own learning. And that's where those two links on screen will help you a lot. The first one is literally pointing to the official GitHub documentation, where you're going to find the starting point pretty similar to what I already explained you here, but obviously allowing you to continue learning at your own pace, reading through additional documentation. And then the second one, something that I didn't really highlight that much in the presentation itself, but it's focusing on fundamentals of what we describe within Microsoft, responsible generative AI. I'm going to walk you through a lot more demos in the other modules in this course, but it's so important to understand that there is a lot of responsibility around it. For example, when you start asking GitHub Copilot to document features, to explain features, but also to validate your code, for example, that's where responsible AI comes in. Positioning this link here just to get that information and try to map it with not only GitHub Copilot, but the broader generative AI solutions like our Microsoft Copilot in M365 and a lot of other tools that we provide in meantime. So with that, we're done with this first module. Thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you again in any of the other course modules.